Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, San Francisco's premier author interview program. And today we have a book award winner with us who's already appeared twice on the show. She's brave enough to come back. Her name is Julia Glass. She won a National Book Award for her first novel, 3 Junes. And we're going to talk today about her second novel, The Whole World Over, which has just come out in trade paperback, courtesy of Anchor Books. Thank you for stopping by.
Well, thank you, Jim. The third time is the charm.
I hope. One of the things that you have revealed in remarks not made on this program of late, but somewhere else, is that The Whole World Over is the kind of novel that every novelist has to do. It's a kind, people think of it as the grand novel because it's about the search for true love. Are you comfortable with that description of The Whole World Over?
Yes, I'm just going to go for the max. You know, it's my second novel. I have nothing to lose. I do think it's true that those of us who really write from the heart at some point have to attack that big question. And you've heard me at recent readings on my tour hold up as the two lodestars, for myself anyway, Middlemarch by George Eliot and Anna Karenina, of course. So, you know, when you're shooting that high, you know you're not going to make it, but you go for it anyway.
I've had the great pleasure in preparing for this interview to kind of read around in the book because I had read it once before. And having done that, I rather agree with that estimation of what's going on, that this is a grand novel. It is a novel about the search for true love. But I think the whole world over is also about other things, and one of them, the limits of love.
Yes, it is. Because I think the truth is that the older one gets, and if one is lucky enough to be engaged in the grappling everyday pursuit of love with someone that you've been with a long time, is that you understand that so-called true love entails a lot of compromise and limitation, and the understanding that ultimately we can never be fully joined with another person, that there's a certain separateness that always remains. I think some people feel you can join with God or other spiritual forces, but with your mate, there's always a fine membrane between you, and it's understanding the nature of that membrane that is part and parcel of love. And
at some moments in that search, a love has to be broken off, and it's that way that you write about so beautifully. I don't want to hurt Alan more than I have, Greenie says. It's you I love. In some form, she said that in some form every time she spoke about her journey. Yet the farther away she traveled, the more desperate it felt to tell him how much she missed him, as if there were only so much distance their attachment could take, as if there were a literal breaking point to the emotional line connecting them. It was hard to talk about anything other than the drama unfolding in the world at large, events they could do nothing about. Charlie was right. Something like this suspended everything else. Even the two of them were suspended. So that's really looking at it in a realistic way, that events impinge upon the creation or the maintenance of the perfect love.
Well, yes, and of course part of this book grapples with the issues of how no matter how well we plan our lives, things happen from the outside that change our plans, and we make choices that we never intended to make that change our plans as well.
One of the great joys of this book is the characters.
It's all about characters.
I mean,
then it's working.
This is infected with some wonderful characters. One of whom I kind of think of as opening the book. The first actor on the stage almost is Walter, who's lovable and funny and frustrating, and ultimately a damn good friend.
Yes, and you know, like many of my characters who were never intended to take up so much room on the stage. Walter was designed as a device he's the main client of the pastry chef who's the heroine, and yet I fell in love with him, and I had to follow his life as well. And he has love troubles all his own.
Oh, doesn't he? He really, really does. But he also has a very fine restaurant, and that's very good for, if we could say, the main character, Greenie, and her business, which is baking.
Yes, she makes the desserts for his restaurant, which is very old-fashioned American cuisine, not haute French or fusion or anything very modern.
That cholesterol heaven.
Casa Cholesterol, that's the nickname for his restaurant.
Well, so the whole world over is about the search for true love. But what is it really about? What's the plot? We're going to find out about that when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Julia Glass is the guest. We're talking about her new novel, now in paperback, The Whole World Over, published by Anchor Books. The Chicago Tribune had some very nice things to say about your book. And they say here, her second novel is even finer than her first. Yeah, okay.
I'll take that.
You take that? Okay. All right. Glass's characters are enticingly complex. Their predicaments are provocative and significant, and their number is numerous. That's the other interesting thing about this book. Her ardor for language itself feeds the freshness, sensuousness, and compassion that make this such a nourishing and pleasurable read. Tribute. And that is true. If you didn't have the power of diction that you have, this thing would be flat. But you do have it, and it's one of the other reviewers called it a bouillabaisse, as I recall.
Yes, a bouillabaisse, yes.
Just full of, and folks, when you look at the jacket for the paperback that I have in my hand, which you can plainly see, it's all about food. It's all kinds of breads on there. The people that listen to a program like this are somewhat interested in the basic plot. But I think the problem with this book, it doesn't have a basic plot. It's kind of like The Whole World Over. It's starting and then it just kind of spreads out like the ripples if you threw a stone into a lake.
Well, I start every piece of fiction with a character. And you know, there's that old adage, character is plot. And another way of saying that is character has consequence. So that there's a cause and effect in the choices that we make because of who we are. Now, you could say, and it wouldn't be entirely a joke, that this book begins with the good old plot device, a stranger comes to town. And I like to say, the stranger comes to town and orders dessert. And because
a specific kind of dessert.
Coconut cake. Writing this book has given me the privilege of tasting many kinds of coconut cake because people always feel compelled to present me with a coconut cake because it is a coconut cake that causes all the trouble and all the joy and all the anguish in these characters' lives. So, but seriously, Greenie Duquette is a woman who has everything by some people's standards. She has the career she's always wanted. She's successful at it. She has a husband she loves very much. They've been married for 10 years. She has this wonderful, precocious son, but her husband has fallen into a very withdrawn and depressed state. And the choices that she makes in her efforts to fix this, because she's nothing if not a fix-it kind of person, those efforts lead her across the country in a move that's a gamble, but that she hopes will shake up her marriage. But that move, in turn, causes a number of changes in the lives of the characters around her, kind of like those little square numbers puzzles that, you know, we try to move them around so that all the numbers are in numerical order. I mean, and for me, because each character that I create has a character, has an inner integrity and personality and flaws that lead them to make choices, it's the intertwining of those choices that create the plot in my novel.
The other fantastic thing that you accomplish, in my opinion, is that when a character does something which superficially or objectively, however you want to say this, is something you'd rather they didn't do, like her moving to New Mexico on
Right.
on a flight of fancy, leaving her husband behind, and you want to say, oh, that's horrible. You should never do a thing like that. But by the time she does that, you're so much into understanding her that it's not a question of you forgive her, but you realize that it's a possible decision. It may not be the right decision, but it's possible.
Yes. Well, I'm very interested in the predicament of smart, loving, sensitive people who make crazy decisions, who make decisions that seem to make sense, but maybe they don't, who make mistakes.
Yeah, in one of their long-distance
folly.
phone calls, she keeps saying to him, we're educated people, we're smart,
Right.
we ought to be able to work this out.
Exactly. I mean, why, if you're incredibly intelligent, if you've organized your life to the best of your abilities, can't you always make it work? And that's part of what's going on. I mean, folly. I like to write about folly. And I think in the books that I read, the characters I love best are those who you start out disliking, or you're very skeptical about them. There's something that rubs you the wrong way, but by the end of the book, not only do you completely empathize with them, but you've fallen in love with them, and maybe they've even broken your heart. And that's the most powerful kind of human drama that a novelist can create.
The one character in this book where I think you succeeded best with that idea is with the husband, Alan. I really do. I think that.
And in a funny way, he's the most like me of all the characters, I have to say.
Yeah.
He's like
very
the dark
interesting.
side of me. He's my cautionary tale.
Okay, The Whole World Over is an absolute feast. And it's a feast by a master chef. When we return, we'll ask the master chef about her methods of trickery and plot.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
This is Conversations on the Coast. I'm Jim Foster. The book today, The Whole World Over. The author, the wonderful Julia Glass, the publisher, Anchor Books. They've had the good sense to put this in trade paperback so that one of the things that can happen, and I want to get to it in a minute, is that book clubs or book groups can access it better. But before we talk about that, let's talk about what the New York Times Book Review said about The Whole World Over. Just when the reader feels sure of an outcome, other forces are set to work, shifting the momentum in unexpected directions. This is particularly admirable because Glass is so unobtrusive a writer, conveying meaning not through insightful asides. So true. No pauses here. Just keep going with the plot. Just keep telling the story. No, not through insightful asides, philosophical musings, or verbal pyrotechnics, but through storytelling.
So
and
you
that's
see,
the great pleasure.
I do write plot, Jim. The New York Times says so.
But the great pleasure is the storytelling.
Yes.
It's the biggie. And that's what people love. And some of the people who love storytelling the most these days belong to things called book clubs or book groups.
Right.
What's that all about? And is it a good thing?
Well, first of all, I think it's a great thing. But I have to confess that I've never been in a book group. And I was somewhat astonished to discover, rather later, I think, than my publisher knew, that the reason 3 Junes took off when it came into paperback is that book groups really fell in love with the book. Now, why that book? Not until I started to meet with some book groups, sometimes through friends, or I did some speakerphone groups. And what I realized is that 3 Junes, and this is true of my second novel, it contained a lot of different kinds of relationships, realistic relationships, intergenerational. There was kind of something that everybody could relate to, whether you were an older parent with a gay child, or whether you were a sibling growing up and your relationship with your siblings are changing because of who they married or because your parents died. All these relationships, a relationship is like an animal, it's constantly changing and being fed and starved, and there are different moods in relationships. So after visiting or just communicating with a couple of book groups, I had a sort of a revelation. Now, I was a very good English student in high school. Even though I went on to become an art major, inexplicably, I find that when I listen to book groups talking about books, it's not like being in an English class. I think I envisioned it was like these people were nostalgic for being in English class. Not at all. The kind of books that work best in book groups are those that call up for their readers some very profound issue in their lives, whether it's getting over the loss of a spouse or falling in love or giving birth or losing a child, going through a divorce. And I think in book groups, and I'm not saying that people who are in book groups are anti-intellectuals or don't talk about books in a cerebral way, but they talk about the book as a conduit to talking about their own lives. And people joke that, the only reason you ever join a book group is so you can drink wine away from your kids and your husbands. You can gripe about the guys. No, that's true in some book groups. And I told you a story about a book group I went to where they talked about 3 Junes for a little bit, and then it was an hour of people talking about skunks in their garages. But that's a whole other thing.
That's a whole other group,
I have seen both of my books elicit debates, and very hot debates, about what is a good marriage? What does it mean to be a good wife, a good husband, a good mother, or even a good child? Because I write a lot about families, and it's very fruitful.
Or just a good lover.
Yes.
Someone, constant in a relationship.
Yes.
What does it mean to treat a somewhat helpless young person in a loving way? And we have in this book with Saga.
I think in this book, one of the hot issues is because there's a marriage at the core. There's a marriage in trouble. Should these people stay together or should they not stay together? And readers disagree enormously on the ending that I've chosen. And when I was writing 3 Junes and I heard people talk about how they didn't like such and such a character or they didn't like a choice that I'd made for my characters, I felt very insecure and a little affronted. But now I feel very excited because I see that it's brought up something in the lives of the readers that they need to discuss. And the book gives them a connection to it. And it can also be quite cathartic. So I've now, I've composed a changing list of books that I recommend to book groups, all fiction, because I can see where thematically they will open up very powerful subjects that people need to talk about and that are not easy to talk about.
Wow.
I mean, fiction puts us in a parallel universe where we can experience a lot of the most powerful emotions in life without just having to examine our own. It's a kind of, it's like a meta therapy in a way.
You have a chance to enter the parallel universe of The Whole World Over. It's a novel by Julia Glass, and it's now in trade paperback. You have no excuse. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Thank you, Jim.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.